Thank you for tuning in to tonight's special news report on the GMO controversy. Unlike a majority of the United Kingdom, the United States does not have any regulations on genetically modified foods. Many adversaries of genetically modified foods believe that they are hazardous to our food and our environment, and therefore think they should at least be regulated. Over the course of this newscast, we will be discussing both sides of the debate on whether genetically modified organisms should be regulated or banned in our food products. But first, we are going to hear from Tommy as he interviews North Central science professors to learn about what GMOs are.
So this is Dr. Weissig. He's a microbiologist for North Central College, and we're going to ask him a few questions about GMOs. So to start, I would just could you briefly explain how we make GMOs?
So usually when people say GMO, they mean organisms with genes that have been deliberately manipulated by genetic engineering. In that case, what we usually do is identify some characteristic you would like, let's say a corn plant to have, maybe insect resistance. We find a source of a gene that would confer that resistance, maybe, for example, a bacterium that produces a natural insecticide, and we can then take the DNA for that gene from the bacterium and put it into a form that the plant would be able to recognize and produce that particular insecticide, and then introduce it into plant cells.
What are some possible negative side effects from adding genes to other plants or other organisms?
Well, so far, we really haven't seen a lot of actual evidence for negative effects. Things that you would worry about are the method that you use to put the gene into the plant cell, and would it disrupt something that would be valuable? So you don't want to make your corn insect resistant but less nutritionally valuable, let's say. You of course have to be cautious about how well you know the effects of that gene. So for example, you introduce an insecticidal toxin. Obviously it can't be a human toxin, so it has to be something that's well characterized wherever it starts out. And we worry about some things that are a little bit harder to put your finger on. So there was some discussion about whether pollen from insecticidal corn could drift over and somehow perhaps infect or affect caterpillars that were feeding on non-genetically modified organisms out in the field nearby, something like that. Again, there has not been a lot of evidence of any actual damage, but those are the sorts of things that you worry about.
So what are some positive things, or why are we doing this on a larger scale as opposed to just simple breeding?
It's faster. You can select for traits in plants for food. Let's say you want to make a corn that can be grown in an area where there's a lot saltier water, right? Coastal area, perhaps not access to fresh water. You can do that by growing some corn in there, and the ones that survive you can then breed to each other, and you should increase over several generations the ability for them to live in this environment. However, that would take several generations, and if you're talking about world hunger, then we don't have several generations of the plant to do this. So the transgene allows for the plant to potentially grow in a saltier environment, saltier water, and we can get that done in one generation.
So what are some negative side effects of changing the food that we're eating that you know of?
They are starting with the same genetic background that they're putting these transgenes in. And so we lose the richness of the genetic diversity. So typically, if you're thinking about corn, we have corn from the East Coast to the West Coast, North and South, and they're potentially, once upon a time, all a different variant. So that allowed them to be healthier. So if some sort of pest came along, potentially a flood, some sort of environmental factor, there's genetic variability that would allow some of them to survive and thrive. You all start with the same seed from Monsanto. It's the same genetic background. You no longer have the genetic diversity in that population, which means if something like this happens, none of them will survive.
Why do you think that now that we're changing it in a matter of a few months is such a controversy with what Monsanto is doing?
You Google it, right, and you get these tomatoes with fangs, right? So some sort of monster tomato that somehow is going to harm you in some way. And if you think about the perception of the United States public on science, it is already very low. They don't trust scientists. And so they think that we are manipulating their food crops and somehow going to do them harm.
Okay, so now that we have heard opinions from scholarly third-party sources, we are now going to be interviewing representatives from Monsanto and the Non-GMO Project. Right now we welcome Billy Gleaves from Monsanto.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Okay, so my first question for you is going to be, in general, just what is Monsanto?
Monsanto is a sustainable agricultural company that provides support to farmers all over the world. We try to license our seeds and traits to as many companies as we can worldwide so that farmers everywhere can have access to our quality products.
Okay, so my next question would be then, are GMOs safe?
Yes, GMO crops and seeds have been tested more than any other crop in the history of agriculture. Any trait that is added to a crop is scrutinized by numerous agencies and third-party researchers. Several scientific organizations, including the National Research Council and the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the American Medical Association, have issued studies or statements regarding the safety of GMOs, indicating that there is no evidence GMOs present unique safety risks associated with compared to conventionally bred products.
Okay, so my next question would be, how long have we been eating these genetically modified foods?
Farmers have always, in a way, been genetically modifying their plants because we always choose to harvest the best crops that yield the most food. Genetic modification in scientific laboratories, though, has only been around for about 30 or so years.
All right, and then my last question to you then would just be, in general, why do we need GMOs?
Well, according to the peer-reviewed sources from the African Journal of Food and Agriculture and Nutrition, biotechnology contributes to poverty alleviation by increasing crop productivity in the Saharan African continent. So, in a way, these desert nations need genetically modified crops so that anything can grow on their land.
All right, thank you, Millie. So now we hear from Marissa Post on the Non-GMO Project.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, so my first question to you is going to be, what is a Non-GMO Project and what does it do?
The Non-GMO Project is a nonprofit organization with the mission of protecting the non-GMO food supply and giving consumers an informed choice. We actually offer North America's only third-party verification for products produced according to rigorous best practices for GMO avoidance. Our strategy is to empower consumers to make changes through the marketplace. If people stop buying GMOs, companies will stop using them and farmers will stop growing them.
Okay, so then my next question would be, what do other countries in general think of GMOs?
Well, quite unlike North America, most developed nations do not consider GMO safe to eat. In more than 60 countries around the world, including Australia, Japan, and all of the countries in the European Union, there are significant restrictions or outright bans on the production and sale of GMOs. In the US, the government has approved GMOs based on studies conducted by the same corporations that created them and profit for their sale.
So would you say that GMOs are safe to eat?
Well, according to GMO Myths and Truths, 2nd edition, studies show that GM foods can be toxic, allergenic, or have unintended nutritional changes. Most animal feeding studies on GMOs are short-term or medium-term in length, and that is too short to show long-term or chronic effects such as organ failure, cancer, and reproductive problems. What we really need are long-term and multi-generational studies on GMOs to see if the signs of toxicity commonly reported in shorter studies develop into serious disease, but such studies are not required by government regulators anywhere in the world.
All right, and my last question for you would just be, what is the relationship between GMOs and world hunger?
Well, again, referring back to GMO Myths and Truths, reports according to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, they say that we already produce more than enough food to feed the world's population and could produce enough with existing agricultural methods to feed 12 billion people. A few GM crops have been specifically promoted as helping small-scale and poor farmers in Africa. However, the results were the opposite of what was promised, and all these projects failed.
All right, well, thank you, Marissa.
Thank you.
So in regards to the FDA and state legislators' stances on GMOs, on April 8th, 2013, the FDA made the following statement. Recently, FDA has received petitions regarding genetically engineered foods, including the labeling of such foods. The agency is currently considering these petitions and at this time has not made a decision, in whole or in part, regarding the petitions. FDA supports voluntary labeling for food derived from genetic engineering. Foods derived from genetically engineered plants must meet the same requirements, including safety requirements, as other foods, such as foods derived from traditionally bred plants. According to the Wall Street Journal, as of July 2014, 3 states have passed GMO labeling legislation: Maine, Vermont, and Connecticut. Furthermore, $35 bills have been introduced in 20 states on the issue, and the ballot initiatives are set in Colorado and Oregon. Unless the FDA changes its stance, changes in the regulation of GMOs will rely upon state legislators. A survey regarding general knowledge of GMOs in the FDA was sent out to students at North Central College. 66 participants answered 5 brief questions to show the public's overall knowledge and stance on the controversy at hand. When asked, do you know what a GMO is, you can see a little more than half the participants were aware of genetically modified organisms to a certain extent, whereas 1/3 had a general idea and approximately 12% were completely unaware of GMOs entirely. While more than half of the participants know what GMOs are, 56% are unaware of the FDA's stance on GMOs, with a fourth having little knowledge and only 20% who are educated on the subject. Whether or not the FDA should regulate GMO ingredients in consumer food products is a controversy among many. More than half of our participants believe the FDA should regulate GMO ingredients in food products, compared to the 30% with no preference and only 5% against regulating it. When given the option to answer the question regarding the FDA banning the use of GMO ingredients in consumer food products, approximately half of our participants were unsure whether or not to ban it, whereas 35% were against it, compared to the 18% who would like to see the GMOs banned by the FDA. Finally, when asked how often our participants check food labels for the presence or absence of GMO ingredients, a little more than half responded, stating they never check their food labels when grocery shopping, with only a small percentage saying they frequently or always check labels before purchasing their food products. And this concludes tonight's news report on the GMO controversy. As we have seen, tensions run high between Monsanto and the non-GMO project. Monsanto believes the research has proven the safety of genetically modified foods, whereas the non-GMO project believes the U.S. should follow suit with the U.K. and ban all genetically modified foods. However, the FDA has yet to take a stance against GMOs, so until then, it would appear that the state legislator will have to take action if they want to see regulations on genetically modified foods. Thank you for tuning in.